My name is Rachel Carter. I'm 33 years old and I work as a paramedic in Denver, Colorado. Most days, my job involves long shifts, ambulance sirens, and helping strangers during the worst moments of their lives. It's not glamorous. It doesn't pay very well. But I've always believed it matters. And until last month, that was enough for me. Then I attended my stepsister's wedding reception, and everything changed. Because halfway through dinner, in front of nearly 200 guests, my stepsister raised her glass, pointed directly at me, and said something that made half the room laugh. "This," she announced loudly to her new husband's family, "is my stepsister Rachel." She paused for effect, then she smirked. "She's just an ambulance driver." A few people chuckled politely. Someone at the table muttered, "Oh, that's nice." I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I just smiled and sat quietly. But a few seconds later, something strange happened. The groom's father stopped eating. He slowly lifted his head and stared directly at me. Not casually, not politely. He studied my face like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he leaned forward slightly and said something that made the entire table go silent. "Wait, haven't we met before?" Before I tell you what happened next, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let's go back to the beginning of that evening, because the moment I walked into that wedding hall, I already knew the night was going to be uncomfortable. The reception was held at Aspen Ridge Country Club, one of the most expensive venues in Denver. The kind of place where weddings look like they belong in magazines. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Soft jazz music floated through the room. Every table was decorated with tall arrangements of white roses and gold candles. Waiters walked around carrying trays of champagne like they were performing choreography. Everyone looked rich. Designer dresses, tailored suits, expensive watches. I felt slightly out of place the moment I stepped inside. Not because anyone said anything, but because my life looked very different from theirs. I wore a simple navy blue dress I had bought on sale a few months earlier. No diamonds, no fancy heels, just something comfortable enough after a 12-hour shift. In fact, I had come directly from work. I barely had time to shower before driving across the city to the venue. In my hands, I carried a small wrapped gift. Nothing extravagant, just something thoughtful, a cookbook my stepsister had mentioned once. To be honest, I almost didn't come at all. But my mother had insisted. "Rachel, she's still family," she told me on the phone earlier that week. Family. That word had always been complicated for us, because technically, Lindsay and I weren't really sisters. We became step-siblings when I was 14. My father had died suddenly from a heart attack. 2 years later, my mom remarried Lindsay's father. From the outside, it looked like we blended into one happy family. But inside the house, things were never that simple. Lindsay grew up very differently than I did. Her father owned several real estate development companies. Money was never a problem for them. Private school, luxury vacations, brand name clothes. Meanwhile, my mom worked 2 jobs most of my childhood. I got my first part-time job at 16. By college, I was working nearly full-time just to pay tuition. Eventually, I chose a career in emergency medical services. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked helping people. Lindsay never understood that. To her, success meant money, status, image. And tonight's wedding was the perfect example. Her new husband, Tyler Whitmore, came from an even wealthier family. His father owned a massive logistics company that operated across the western United States. Everyone at this wedding seemed connected to that world. Investors, executives, politicians, people who talked about million-dollar deals the way normal people talk about grocery shopping. I quietly slipped inside and placed my gift on the long table near the entrance. A few relatives noticed me and waved politely. Others didn't recognize me at all, which honestly was fine. I preferred staying invisible. After grabbing a glass of water from a passing tray, I found an empty seat at the far end of one of the long reception tables. From there, I could see Lindsay moving through the crowd. She looked exactly how she had always imagined her wedding day. Perfect. Her white dress sparkled under the lights, her makeup looked flawless, and she smiled constantly as guests congratulated her. Tyler stayed close beside her. He seemed nice enough, quiet, calm, almost the opposite of Lindsay's personality. I'd only met him twice before the wedding, but he had always been polite. About 20 minutes later, dinner service began. Guests slowly returned to their tables. Soft conversations filled the room as waiters placed plates in front of everyone. The band near the dance floor played gentle instrumental music. For a while, everything felt normal, peaceful even. Then Lindsay suddenly stood up. She tapped her spoon against her champagne glass. The sharp ringing sound echoed across the room. Conversations faded as people turned their attention toward her. She smiled brightly. "I just want to introduce someone to Tyler's family." My stomach tightened immediately, because I already knew where this was going. Her eyes moved across the room, then stopped directly on me. "Rachel," she called out loudly, "come here for a second." Dozens of people turned to look. I felt heat rise in my face, but refusing would only make things worse. So I stood up and slowly walked toward the main table. Every step felt longer than the last. When I reached her, Lindsay placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. From a distance, it probably looked affectionate, but I knew that smile. I had seen it many times growing up. It was the smile she used right before turning someone into the punchline of a joke. She turned toward Tyler's family. "This," she said cheerfully, gesturing toward me, "is my stepsister Rachel." Then she paused dramatically and laughed. Before anyone asks, another pause. "She's just an ambulance driver." A few guests chuckled. Someone whispered, "Oh." Another person nodded politely. I felt that familiar wave of embarrassment in my chest, but I didn't react. I simply smiled. Arguing with Lindsay had never helped in the past, so I stayed quiet. Eventually, the conversation at the table resumed. People returned to their food. Glasses clinked again. For a moment, I thought the awkward moment had passed, but then something unexpected happened. Across the table, Tyler's father had stopped eating. His name was Richard Whitmore, a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes. At first, I assumed he was just listening to the conversation, but then I noticed something strange. He was staring directly at me, not casually, not politely, carefully, like he was searching through a memory. After a moment, he slowly set his fork down. Tyler noticed. "Dad, everything okay?" Richard nodded slightly. "Yes, I'm fine." But he didn't stop looking at me. Meanwhile, Lindsay kept talking about honeymoon plans. "We're flying to Italy tomorrow," she said excitedly. "Rome first, then the Amalfi Coast." Guests congratulated them again, but Richard still looked distracted. Finally, he turned toward Tyler. "What did you say her name was?" Tyler glanced at me. "Rachel." Richard repeated the name quietly. "Rachel?" He leaned back in his chair, still thinking. Lindsay laughed lightly. "Oh, don't worry about Rachel," she said. "She basically lives inside ambulances." A few guests smiled politely, but Richard didn't laugh. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and asked me a question. "I'm sorry," he said thoughtfully. "Have we met somewhere before?" I blinked in surprise. "I don't think so," I replied. "I meet a lot of people through work, though." He nodded slowly. "That makes sense." For a moment, it looked like he might say something else, but then the band suddenly started playing a louder song. People clapped. Several guests stood up and walked toward the dance floor. The moment dissolved into noise and laughter again. Lindsay grabbed Tyler's hand. "Time to dance." Within minutes, most of the room had shifted toward the music, but Richard Whitmore stayed seated for a moment longer, still looking at me, still thinking. Finally, he stood up and said something quietly, almost to himself. "I'm sure we met during a very important moment." Then he walked toward the dance floor, leaving me sitting there wondering what moment he was trying to remember, and what he would say when he finally did. The music on the dance floor grew louder. People laughed, glasses clinked, and the wedding slowly returned to the cheerful atmosphere Lindsay wanted for her big night. But I couldn't stop thinking about what Richard Whitmore had said. "I'm sure we met during a very important moment." I replayed those words over and over in my head while I sat quietly at the edge of the reception hall. As a paramedic, I meet hundreds of people every year. Car accidents, heart attacks, construction injuries. overdoses, house fires. Faces blur together after a while, but something about the way Richard looked at me made it clear that whatever moment he was remembering, it meant something serious. Something emotional. Still, I couldn't place him. Eventually, I stood up and walked toward the bar to grab a glass of water. The bartender slid it toward me with a polite smile. "You part of the bride's family?" he asked casually. "Something like that," I replied. He nodded knowingly. "Big crowd tonight. Must have cost a fortune." I glanced around the ballroom again. He wasn't wrong. This wedding probably cost more than I made in several years. Crystal glasses, imported flowers, a live band, an ice sculpture shaped like two swans. It felt like something out of a movie, and yet somehow I still felt like the only person in the room who didn't belong there. I was halfway through my drink when someone approached beside me. "Rachel?" I turned. It was Tyler. He looked slightly awkward standing there, hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I replied. For a moment, we both just stood there listening to the music. Then he scratched the back of his neck. "I wanted to apologize for Lindsay earlier." I blinked. "You don't need to do that." "No, I kind of do," he said with a small sigh. "She likes to joke around, but sometimes she doesn't realize when it comes off wrong." I smiled politely. "It's fine, I'm used to it." But Tyler didn't look convinced. "My dad usually doesn't react to things like that," he continued. "But when he looked at you earlier, it was like he was seeing a ghost." That made my curiosity spike again. "Has he ever mentioned meeting a paramedic before?" I asked. Tyler thought for a moment. "Not that I can remember." Then he shrugged. "He's had a pretty wild life, though. Business trips all over the world. Who knows?" At that moment, the band switched songs. A slower one. Couples filled the dance floor. Tyler glanced toward Lindsay across the room. She was laughing with a group of bridesmaids, holding a glass of champagne. "Anyway," he said, "thanks for coming tonight." Then he walked back toward the dance floor. I returned to my seat at the table. Dinner plates had been cleared away. Dessert was being served now. Small slices of chocolate cake decorated with gold flakes. Guests chatted happily, but one person was still watching me. Richard Whitmore. He stood near the edge of the dance floor, speaking with a group of older men. Yet every few seconds, his eyes drifted back toward my table, like he was trying to confirm something, or maybe waiting for another memory to surface. About 20 minutes later, the band announced a short break. Guests slowly returned to their tables again. Richard walked back and sat down across from me. This time he looked different, more certain. Like the answer he'd been searching for was almost within reach. He leaned forward slightly. "Rachel, right?" "Yes." He studied my face again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Have you always worked as a paramedic?" "About 9 years now." He nodded slowly. "Denver Fire Department?" "Yes." Now his eyes widened slightly. Like another puzzle piece had clicked into place. "Did you ever work night shifts?" I laughed softly. "Almost all of them." "That makes sense," he murmured. The people around us began listening now. Even Lindsay had returned to the table. She sat down beside Tyler and glanced between us. "What's going on?" she asked lightly. Richard didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he asked me another question. "Rachel, about 4 years ago, were you working on a night shift in late October?" My heart skipped, because suddenly a very specific memory flashed into my mind. Cold wind. Rain. Emergency lights reflecting off wet pavement. The smell of jet fuel. But I still wasn't completely sure. "I might have been," I said carefully. Richard inhaled slowly. Then he turned toward his son. "Tyler." "Yeah, Dad?" "Do you remember the accident I had in 2022? Tyler frowned slightly. "The plane incident?" "Yes." Now the entire table went quiet. Even Lindsay stopped moving. "You told me the emergency responders saved your life," Tyler continued. Richard nodded. "They did." Then he looked back at me. But there was one paramedic in particular who never left my side. My chest tightened. Because now I remembered the private jet, the emergency landing, the crash. and the man trapped inside. Richard's voice softened as he continued. That night, my pilot tried to land during a storm just outside Denver. Several guests leaned closer. The landing gear malfunctioned, he explained. We slid off the runway. Tyler's eyes widened. I remember the news about that. Richard nodded again. The cockpit was crushed. He paused for a moment, and I was pinned inside the cabin. No one at the table spoke. Even the music from the band seemed distant now. The fire crews worked to cut the door open, Richard continued quietly. But the storm delayed the trauma team. He looked directly at me. For almost 40 minutes, there was only one person inside that wreckage with me. My throat felt tight, because I knew what he was about to say. Richard slowly pointed toward me. That paramedic was Rachel. Gasps spread around the table. Tyler turned toward me in shock. You were there? I nodded slightly. It was part of my shift. Richard shook his head firmly. No, it was much more than that. His voice grew emotional now. The plane was leaking fuel, he said. The firefighters kept telling her to come out. Several guests stared at me, but she refused to leave, Richard continued. She stayed inside the cabin the entire time, keeping me conscious. I remembered it clearly now. The smell of burning metal, the rain soaking through my uniform, Richard barely breathing, talking to him constantly so he wouldn't pass out. You kept asking me questions, he said softly, about my son, about my childhood, about anything that would keep me awake. I felt embarrassed being the center of attention again. That's what paramedics do, I said quietly. But Richard shook his head again. No, his voice was stronger now. That's what heroes do. The table went completely silent. Lindsay looked frozen. Her earlier confidence had vanished. Richard turned slowly toward her. You introduced her tonight as just an ambulance driver. No one laughed this time. You shouldn't say just when you're talking about someone who saves lives. Lindsay's face turned pale. For the first time all evening, she didn't have a witty response ready. Tyler stood up from his chair. Then he walked around the table toward me. The room seemed to shrink as people watched. He extended his hand. Rachel, he said sincerely, thank you for saving my dad. I shook his hand, feeling incredibly uncomfortable with the attention. I was just doing my job. Richard leaned forward again. And you did it better than anyone else could have. Guests nearby began whispering. Some looked embarrassed about laughing earlier. Others stared at Lindsay with quiet disapproval. Meanwhile, Lindsay sat completely still, her champagne glass untouched in her hand. For once, the spotlight she loved so much had turned in a direction she didn't control, and the entire room could feel it. But what happened next was something none of us expected, because Richard Whitmore wasn't finished talking. And the next thing he revealed would change the entire tone of Lindsay's wedding night. The entire table stayed silent. For several seconds, no one spoke. You could hear the faint clinking of glasses from other tables across the ballroom. But at ours, the air had turned heavy. Everyone was looking at me now. Some with curiosity, some with respect, and a few with embarrassment after laughing earlier. But the one person who looked the most uncomfortable was Lindsay. Her smile had disappeared. She sat frozen beside Tyler, staring down at the tablecloth like she wished the moment would simply pass. Unfortunately for her, Richard Whitmore wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair slowly, still looking at me. You know, he said quietly, there's something else my family never fully understood about that night. Tyler frowned slightly. What do you mean? Richard folded his hands on the table. The official report said the firefighters pulled me out once the door was cut open. That's what I remember reading, Tyler said. Richard nodded. That part is true. He paused, but what the report didn't explain was what happened during those 40 minutes before the rescue team arrived. The people sitting closest leaned in. Even guests from the neighboring table were starting to listen now. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair. I already knew where this was going, and I honestly wished he would stop, because paramedics don't do what we do for recognition. We do it because someone has to. But Richard continued. When the plane stopped sliding, The cabin lights were out, he said. It was dark, raining, and the wind was howling across the runway. His voice grew quieter. The cockpit had collapsed forward and my leg was pinned under a metal support beam. Tyler's eyes widened. I didn't know it was that bad. Richard gave a faint smile. That's because Rachel never told anyone. Now all eyes turned back toward me again. I felt heat rising in my face. I was just doing my job, I repeated softly. But Richard shook his head. No. Then he looked around the table. The firefighters were worried about the fuel leak, he continued. They kept warning everyone that the plane could ignite if the fuel reached the hot engine parts. A woman sitting nearby covered her mouth. Richard looked back at me. They told Rachel to come out. I remembered that moment clearly. Standing in the broken cabin doorway, one firefighter shouting over the wind, "You need to step back, ma'am. We can't guarantee this thing won't blow." But Richard kept speaking. She refused, he said. Tyler looked stunned. You stayed inside the plane? I nodded slowly. Richard continued. She crawled through the broken seats and wreckage to reach me. His voice grew emotional. And she stayed there the entire time. Someone whispered quietly behind us. That's insane. Richard heard it. He turned slightly. Not insane. Then he gestured toward me. Brave. I shifted again, wishing the attention would move somewhere else. But the story was already unfolding in front of everyone. Richard leaned forward. The storm made it difficult for the medical helicopter to land, he said, and the trauma surgeons were stuck across the city because of flooding on the highway. Tyler looked confused. So you were trapped there? For 40 minutes, Richard said. And during that time, Rachel never stopped talking to me. I remembered it vividly. As a paramedic, one of the most important things we do is keep patients conscious. Once someone loses consciousness during severe trauma, the chances of survival drop dramatically. So I had kept him talking, about anything. His childhood, his business, his son. Every time I started fading, Richard continued, she would ask me another question. He looked at Tyler. She asked me what your first baseball game was like. Tyler blinked. Seriously? Richard nodded. And when my breathing got worse, she held an oxygen mask over my face with one hand while trying to keep the beam from crushing my leg with the other. Now, the people around us were staring in. Disbelief. Lindsay slowly raised her eyes toward me. Her expression had changed completely. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore, it looked like shock. Tyler spoke again. Dad, the firefighters didn't mention any of this. They didn't know everything that happened inside that cabin, Richard replied. They were focused on cutting the door open. He paused, and Rachel made sure no one thought she did anything special. I cleared my throat. It wasn't special. But Richard's voice grew firm. Yes, it was. He looked directly at Lindsay now. And you introduced her tonight as just an ambulance driver. Lindsay swallowed. Her lips parted slightly. But no words came out. Richard's gaze softened again as he looked back at me. Rachel, do you remember what you said to me right before they pulled me out? I thought for a moment. But then I remembered. Clear as day. I told you your son would be waiting for you, I said quietly. Richard nodded slowly. You did. Tyler looked between us. I didn't know any of this. Richard smiled faintly. That's because Rachel didn't want anyone to. The table stayed silent again. Finally, Tyler took a deep breath. Then he turned toward Lindsay. Did you know about this? Lindsay shook her head quickly. No. Her voice sounded smaller than usual. I had no idea. She looked at me again. For the first time that evening, there was no sarcasm in her expression, just confusion, and maybe a little guilt. But before anyone could say anything else, Richard spoke again. And what he said next surprised even me. Rachel didn't just save my life that night. The room grew still again. Tyler frowned slightly. What do you mean? Richard folded his hands together. If she hadn't kept me alive, I wouldn't have been able to finish the deal I was working on at the time. Tyler looked puzzled. What deal? Richard smiled faintly. The one that built the company you're inheriting. Several guests exchanged surprised glances. Richard continued calmly. That business expansion created over 3,000 jobs. He looked around the table, and it supported dozens of families across this state. Then he looked back at me, all because one paramedic refused to leave a burning plane. I shook my head quickly. That's not why I did it. But Richard raised a hand gently. I know. Then he said something that made the room even quieter. But sometimes the people who change the world the most don't even realize they've done it. Across the table, Lindsay sat perfectly still. The woman who loved being the center of attention more than anything else had suddenly become the quietest person in the room, and for the first time in her life, she looked like she had no idea what to say. But what happened next would make her wedding night even more unforgettable, because Richard Whitmore had one more announcement to make, and this one would change how everyone in that room saw me. The ballroom had grown quieter than it had been all evening. Richard Whitmore leaned back slightly in his chair, but his eyes never left me. Then he spoke again. I don't usually do this in public, he said calmly, but tonight is different. Tonight, I want everyone in this room to know something very important. Guests shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, trying to catch every word. Even the band stopped playing momentarily, sensing the tension. Richard cleared his throat. 4 years ago, during a terrible storm in October, I was involved in a private jet crash outside Denver. A few people gasped quietly. I was trapped inside the wreckage, he continued. The plane was leaking fuel, the storm made conditions impossible, and the trauma team couldn't reach me in time. He paused and looked at me directly. And during those critical 40 minutes, one person stayed with me the entire time. One person refused to leave even when it was dangerous. One person kept me conscious, calm, and alive. His eyes scanned the room. That person is Rachel Carter. The room erupted into murmurs. People whispered among themselves, trying to process what they had just heard. Tyler's jaw dropped. Lindsay's hand flew to her mouth. Her champagne glass slipped slightly in her fingers. Richard continued, his voice calm but powerful. Rachel is not just an ambulance driver. She is someone who saved my life. And if it weren't for her, I would not be sitting here today, watching my son get married. The words hit the room like a lightning strike. Tyler stood, stunned, looking back and forth between his father and me. Dad, He started, but couldn't finish. Richard shook his head. You don't need to say anything. Just know this. Courage, dedication, and selflessness aren't measured by your title, your salary, or your wardrobe. They're measured by actions, and Rachel's actions that night were nothing short of heroic. The guests fell silent. Even Lindsay, usually so poised, was frozen. Her face had drained of color. A few older women sitting nearby whispered to each other, "She saved a billionaire." One of them muttered, shaking her head. "She stayed in the plane while it could have exploded," said another. I felt my cheeks flush, not from pride, but from sheer discomfort. I wasn't used to this kind of attention. I had done what I had to do. That's all. But the room wouldn't let it go. Richard looked toward Lindsay. His tone shifted slightly, not angry, but firm. You introduced her tonight as just an ambulance driver. That was disrespectful. But now, I hope you understand. Titles mean nothing compared to the lives we save. Lindsay's lips parted and she opened her mouth as if to reply, but no words came. Tyler stepped closer to me, still looking shocked. Rachel, I had no idea. I didn't know. It's okay, I said quietly. He shook his head. No, it's not okay. You risked your life, and my mom never even told me about it? I smiled faintly. I told no one. It wasn't about recognition, it was about keeping your dad alive. Tyler's expression softened. He owes you his life. I owe you, he trailed off, realizing words weren't enough. Richard leaned back, letting the silence settle over the room. Then he added one final thing. Rachel, I want you to know that your courage will never be forgotten. Not by me. Not by my family. And certainly not by anyone here who now understands what you did that night. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, one by one, the guests began clapping. It started small, just a few whispers and pats on the back, but soon the applause grew louder. People were standing, Some guests were wiping away tears. Lindsay sat frozen, staring at me as if I had become someone she didn't recognize. For the first time, the stepsister who had spent years trying to belittle me had nothing to say. I felt a mix of emotions: embarrassment, relief, and something I hadn't felt in years: validation. Tyler reached for my hand. "Rachel, I don't know how to thank you, but I want you to know, my family is in your debt." I shook my head again. "You don't have to do anything. Really. I was doing my job." Richard interrupted gently. "Sometimes doing your job is heroic. Tonight proves that. Everyone, let this be a reminder: the quietest people often do the bravest things." The band slowly resumed playing. The room filled with music again, but the energy had shifted. Now, the attention was no longer on the bride or her luxury wedding. It was on me, the quiet paramedic who had saved a life. And Lindsay, she stayed silent the rest of the night. No more jokes, no more playful smirks. Her big night had lost its spotlight, and the room finally saw the truth. Tyler stayed close beside me for the rest of the evening, checking in and making sure I had everything I needed. And for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. Because sometimes it takes just one moment of truth to change how everyone sees you. And that night, my moment had finally come. The wedding hall had returned to a semblance of normalcy. Guests clinked glasses, laughed, and returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere had changed. The spotlight that Lindsay had so carefully curated for her big night had shifted completely. No one was laughing at me anymore. In fact, whispers followed her instead. She really stayed in a plane that could have exploded. One woman murmured behind her hand, "She saved his life." "And all Lindsay could do was make fun of her?" another whispered. I noticed Lindsay shifting uncomfortably in her seat. Her smile had vanished entirely, replaced by a tense, tight-lipped expression. She glanced toward Tyler, who was still seated beside me, and the look in his eyes said everything: confusion, respect, and perhaps a little disappointment. Tyler leaned closer to me, speaking just quietly enough for the two of us to hear. I didn't know any of this. I mean, she never told me anything about you," he said, his voice low. I shrugged. "I didn't think it was anyone else's business. My job isn't about recognition." He shook his head, still staring at me in disbelief. "No, wow. I mean, that's incredible." I smiled faintly, awkwardly. "It's just what had to be done." Richard Whitmore, however, had one more thing to say. He turned to the room and spoke firmly, ensuring every guest could hear him. "Tonight, let this be a reminder that courage and dedication don't always come with gold bracelets or designer labels. Sometimes the bravest acts are done quietly, without anyone knowing." Guests murmured their agreement. A few started nodding in approval. Lindsay's jaw tightened. She looked around, realizing the social tide had turned. After a few moments, Tyler rose from his seat. He turned to Lindsay quietly, speaking in a tone only she could hear. "Lindsay, we need to talk," he said, his voice calm but serious. Lindsay looked confused. "About what?" she whispered. "About tonight. About how you introduced Rachel and what actually happened." She fidgeted nervously, avoiding his gaze. "It was just a joke." "It wasn't funny," he said softly, shaking his head. "You embarrassed her in front of my family and your new in-laws. And the truth is that she saved my dad's life. Do you understand that?" Lindsay swallowed. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Tyler shook his head, clearly frustrated. Meanwhile, Richard was speaking with a few of his business associates. But every now and then his eyes flicked toward me, nodding subtly, acknowledging that the story had been told correctly. I tried to shrink into my chair, but it was impossible. The whispers, the clapping earlier, and the looks of admiration made me feel exposed. And yet, for the first time, it was a positive exposure. After a few minutes, Richard called me over. "Rachel," he said quietly, away from most of the guests, "would you join me at the head table for a moment?" I stood slowly and followed him. The whispers grew louder. People were watching closely now. Lindsay's face was pale, her hands clutching her glass. She looked like she might actually regret the earlier humiliation. Richard handed me a small envelope. "This is just a small token," he said, "for the courage you showed. But more importantly, it's a way for us to show our gratitude." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten note from Richard and a check. It wasn't just generous, it was overwhelming. "Rachel," he said softly, "I want you to know that the Whitmore family will always support you. Not because of your job title, but because of your character." My eyes widened. I can't accept this," I said quietly. He shook his head firmly. "Yes, you can. And you should. You earned it." Tyler watched the exchange closely. He stepped closer and said, "Rachel, you don't even realize how much you've done. All of this, it's amazing." I felt a lump in my throat. I wasn't used to being in the spotlight. I wasn't used to praise. But tonight, I realized that sometimes recognition comes in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, Lindsay stayed at the table. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't try to regain attention. For the first time, she was quiet, really quiet. The whispers around the room grew louder. Guests began comparing Rachel's bravery with Lindsay's earlier mockery. People were subtly shaking their heads at Lindsay. Some were clearly impressed with me. I sat down again, feeling a strange mix of emotions, pride, relief, and discomfort. The wedding went on. Dancing resumed. Laughter filled the room. But the energy had shifted irrevocably. Tyler stayed by my side for the rest of the evening, checking in, making sure I was comfortable, and subtly showing his admiration for what I had done. And Lindsay, she sat quietly, observing, probably realizing for the first time that life sometimes rewards humility and courage more than wealth or social status. That night, as I left the reception, I reflected on what had happened. Sometimes the world's loudest voices aren't the most important. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, doing the right thing, risking everything, and never asking for recognition, who leave the biggest impact. And that night, in front of everyone, the truth had finally been seen. The night at Aspen Ridge Country Club slowly drew to a close. The band had played their final song. Guests were saying their goodbyes, and Lindsay and Tyler's wedding had officially ended. But for me, the events of the evening hadn't ended, not by a long shot. Lindsay sat quietly at the table, picking at the remaining crumbs of her wedding cake. Her usual confidence was gone, replaced by a hollow, uncomfortable silence. For the first time in my life, I saw her unsure of herself. She glanced at me a few times, but her eyes quickly darted away whenever they met mine. Tyler came over once more before the final goodbyes. "Rachel," he said, his voice low but firm, "I just want to say thank you again for everything. Not just tonight, but 4 years ago, you saved my dad. You saved his life." I shook my head. "It was my job, Tyler. That's all." He smiled faintly. "No, it wasn't. You went above and beyond. I don't know if you realize it, but you changed my family's life. And mine." I felt a lump in my throat. I appreciate that." He looked thoughtful for a moment. Then he lowered his voice, almost like he was confiding a secret. "And Lindsay, she needs to understand something. Tonight was a lesson, not just for her, but for everyone. Sometimes humility, courage, and integrity mean more than status, wealth, or appearances." I nodded quietly. Tyler smiled warmly, then turned back toward his family, clearly ready to reconcile the complicated emotions of the evening. Meanwhile, Lindsay finally found her voice. She stood awkwardly, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Her usual bravado was gone. "Rachel," she began, her voice small. I looked up at her, curious. I didn't know." "I shouldn't have said that," she admitted. Her hands fidgeted nervously. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. I was just, I don't know, trying to be funny." I see now that I was wrong. I swallowed, surprised. For years, Lindsay had never apologized sincerely, but tonight her words were honest. "Thank you," I said carefully. "That means a lot." She nodded, relief and discomfort mixing in her expression. Maybe we can start over?" she asked quietly. I considered it. Despite everything, she was still my stepsister. And sometimes family meant second chances. "Maybe," I said with a faint smile. Tyler watched the exchange, a soft smile on his face. See? Tonight was about more than just the wedding. It was about seeing people for who they really are. As the last of the guests departed, Richard Whitmore came over one final time. "Rachel," he said, his tone serious but warm, "I want you to know that my family will always support you. Not because of your job title, but because of your courage, integrity, and character. You didn't just save my life, you changed the lives of everyone in my family." I felt a mix of pride and humility. "I just did what I had to do," I said softly. He shook his head firmly. "No, you did more than anyone could imagine. Tonight proved that." The night air outside the country club was crisp and calm. I stepped out onto the stone terrace and took a deep breath, letting the events of the evening settle in. The city lights of Denver stretched out before me, sparkling like a reminder that life is unpredictable, messy, and sometimes beautiful in the quietest ways. For years, I had been overlooked, underestimated, and belittled. Tonight, the truth had finally been seen. I looked back toward the barroom. Lindsay was standing beside Tyler, quietly talking to him. The energy between them had changed. She was humbled, but perhaps wiser. And the rest of the guests had dispersed, leaving a lingering sense that the world can reward courage, humility, and integrity in ways we never expect. As I walked to my car, I reflected on the night. Sometimes life gives us moments that define us, not through recognition or applause, but through actions that speak louder than words. And tonight, I realized that the quietest moments of bravery can echo louder than the loudest jokes. Sometimes, the people who change the world aren't the ones on stage. They're the ones quietly doing the right thing when no one is watching. And sometimes, just sometimes, the world finally notices. As I drove home, I felt a strange mix of relief, pride, and calm. My life as a paramedic hadn't changed. I'd still be running calls, saving lives, and helping people in emergencies. But something fundamental had shifted. For the first time, the world saw me, not as a stepsister in a simple dress, not as someone to mock, but as someone who mattered. And that night, an entire room learned an important lesson. Never underestimate someone because of their job, their appearance, or their social status. True courage and integrity shine brighter than gold, diamonds, or designer labels. And for me, that was more than enough.